as usual, if you have any questions at all about the content in this class or any questions as you pursue your real estate career, whether it be contract questions, legal type questions, or even sales type questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Give me a call at the office. That's the best way to reach me during business hours. If we don't pick up the phone, my extension's 1001. You'll probably go to voicemail because I'm on the phone, as you can imagine, quite a bit. Also, email me. I return all calls, or at least I attempt to. Nobody bats 1,000. But if you leave me a message, plan on getting a return call. And if you don't, it may be I didn't get the message. Evenings and weekends, I believe that if you're working, I should at least be available. I may not be working at the same time you're working, but if you're working with clients evenings or weekends and you have a question, best way to reach me is to text my cell number there on the screen, and give me a number to call you at. And I keep my cell nearby. I don't often turn the ringer on, just sort of a quirk of mine, but I do keep it nearby. My phone lights up when I get a text, and I will call you back. So call if you have questions. Let's get right into the content. We're going to talk about the new RPA, the December 21 release, and this is probably going to be a 3-part class. I'm positive it's going to be at least 2 parts, and I'm fairly confident I can get it wrapped up in 3 parts. Today is going to be perhaps the most significant class because we're going to talk about what might be the most major change to the RPA. Lindsay emailed the handout with this notice this morning, so all of you have that available to you. Hopefully you're able to download it, maybe print it, make a note or two, but you're going to see in the first few pages a completely new look to the RPA, and I'm going to explain a lot of those features to you. So let's take a look at the new RPA. This release is scheduled, as I said, for the second week in December. So the RPA will say 12/21 on the bottom. It's the first major revision since 2014. So they made revisions from time to time, but the last time they completely reorganized the RPA and incorporated quite a few major changes was in 2014. That was when they introduced the concept of active contingency removal, and that had quite an impact on the way we practice real estate. This new RPA doesn't make those types of changes. You're still going to follow pretty much the procedures that you followed with the old RPA, but it's far better organized and far more detailed, especially in the areas that buyers and sellers negotiate. You'll see what I mean in a moment. So much of it does remain the same, but much of it is new. So here are the highlights of what's new, and this is just sort of give you a preview of some of the things we'll be talking about going forward. There's quite a few new features in this RPA, and I would submit that once you get used to it, you're going to like it a whole lot better than the RPA we're using today. By the way, the RPA that Lindsay emailed to you, that's a special trainer copy. That is not to be used yet. It has not been released, so don't use it. Wait until the release, and then it'll be in zip forms. But the nice thing about that form that I emailed out, or Lindsay emailed out, is we were able to remove the sample from it, so it's real clear and easy to read along and follow along. Okay, so as you noticed, it's 16 pages. The old one was 10. There are 63 associated forms with this new RPA. That's not a big change. The old RPA, the current one, has 59 associated forms. So there's a few new forms, but not a lot. But these forms have, many of them, been significantly revised to coincide with the changes in the new RPA. There's a greatly expanded bundling feature in the new RPA. What does that mean? That means that anytime you click on an option, you check a box or that references another form, that form will automatically attach to your RPA. So, I mean, it just, most of these associated forms will attach to the RPA if it's necessary. So, you know, simple things like the COP, if you click on that box, the COP is going to automatically attach and be a part of your RPA. And so quite an expansion of that feature. They've eliminated some of the specific purchase agreements and replaced them with specific addenda to address specific purchases. And I'll give you a little more detail on that in just a minute. Form navigation is another new feature, and you're going to love this. By hovering over any paragraph is in the grid, those first 3 pages, if you glance at the RPA, if you hover over any of those paragraphs in the left-hand column, while you're in zip forms, it will take you to that specific paragraph. So as you're talking about contingencies to your client or reviewing it, when you hover over the contingency subparagraph in paragraph 3, you will then go right to the contingency detail paragraph. Now, if you navigate around that paragraph, you can then go back by hovering and hyperlinking back to the grid again. So moving around in this RPA is going to be pretty fantastic, I think. I think you're going to like that. All the fillable fields that are basically the kinds of terms that you negotiate are located in paragraph 3, which is the first 3 pages. So the old RPA had things that you had to negotiate, blanks you had to fill in, sprinkled throughout the entire RPA. They are now located in the first 3 pages. So that makes it much easier to be aware of the negotiated terms, and then the balance of the RPA gives you details and explanations about the parties' obligations. So that first 3 pages, that's what we call the grid, right? That's the grid. That's going to be a common term I think we're all going to adopt. We're going to look at the grid to get a pretty good idea of what the buyer and the seller's obligations are. This is what the grid looks like. Those are the first 3 pages of the RPA. So like I said, if you hover your mouse over this paragraph here, L2, this paragraph references paragraph, I think it's 8B. That'll take you right to 8B back in the contract. So, and then likewise, if you check any of the forms that you might have an option to include, it will attach the form to your contract. All the fill-in fields have text overflow. Some of them did in the past, but many of them did not. They've included text overflow on every field that you can type stuff in. All related contract terms are grouped within the grid. So all the contingencies are in one place. All the time frames are in one place. You know, and you'll see that as we go through it. So you don't have to go back and forth through various paragraphs to find different contingencies, for example, or who pays for what. Everything is grouped, and so that's going to simplify working with the RPA. Related timeframes and defaults are standardized. For example, and I'll mention this again, most of the timeframes for contingencies have been taken back to 17 days. So, you know, you had 17 days and 21 days, and, you know, some of those different contingency time periods, they are now standardized. They can be changed, but they're standardized. Same with defaults. And defaults are pretty straightforward and standardized. And again, you'll see what I mean. Addenda and advisories are grouped on page 4. Liquidated damages and arbitration of dispute clauses have been blocked out, and then they appear on page 14 at the end of the contract rather than spread over a couple of pages. And they've been blocked to separate them from the mediation clause. A lot of agents and principals misunderstand that mediation is something you agree to or don't agree to. The fact is, you do agree to mediation when you sign the purchase contract, because it's in the boilerplate of the purchase contract. It's not part of liquidated damages or arbitration. And so by blocking those two clauses, they made that a little clearer. An RCSD-B, represented capacity signature disclosure, is actually incorporated into the agreement for the buyer. So if the buyer is an entity, you can fill out the paperwork on page 15, and you do not have to provide an RCSD for the buyer. Now, if you end up adding a buyer who's an entity, then you would have to provide that. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail about that, but that form is often misunderstood. That form benefits the person providing it. It is not an authority document. It's a document that says, look, I'm signing on behalf of my trust, not on behalf of me. I'm not individually liable, my trust is. Or I'm signing on behalf of my corporation. I am not responsible, my corporation is. So it's a disclosure that protects the person making the disclosure. It is not an authority document. If a corporation had a vice president of acquisition and she was empowered to buy property, you would still have to have some sort of authority document, typically a letter from the corporation saying this person is authorized to bind the corporation in the purchase of real property. The RCSD, as I said, simply protects the signer from being pulled into a lawsuit in an individual capacity. So I wanted to explain that a little bit. Acceptance and rejection is grouped. Not a big deal, but it's nice to have them on the same page. You either accept the contract or you reject it and send it back to the buyer's agent. And then finally, my last highlight is the real estate broker section has been expanded a bit and now includes a declaration of designated electronic delivery addresses. And there's a feature you can have more than one address. And a statement and understanding that delivery to these designated electronic delivery addresses constitute delivery of the document. So that makes delivering documents back and forth a little simpler. Okay, an important note about the RPA, the grid, those first 3 pages, is not a summary. First time I looked at the RPA more than almost a year ago, I said to myself, oh my gosh, that's a nice summary, but how do we know they're going to put the same number in the summary blank that they put in the body of the contract? Well, what I've learned, since then, there is only one place to put a number. It doesn't duplicate. So the grid is not a summary. It is simply grouping all of the blanks throughout the current RPA in one location, well, on 3 pages, 2.5 pages, in one location so that you can, see all of those types of terms quickly and easily. Not a summary. It contains actual contract terms. Whatever's in that grid is binding on the parties, assuming it's agreed to. So such things as time frames for performance are in the grid. The amounts of money to be paid, how much money are we going to pay for something? It's in the grid. It's no place else in the RPA. And then finally, who's responsible for payment? Who pays? It's in the grid. It's the only place it is. So don't think of the grid as a summary. It's not a summary. Okay, the balance of the RPA, of course, is equally important, pages 14 through 16, because it contains explanations that are significant in carrying out the obligations of the buyer and the seller. So agents should become familiar with the entire RPA. You should go through it in detail. You're going to want to get familiar with the grid. The good news is pages 14 through 16 are very similar to the pages in the current RPA, but there are some additional features and nuances that you're going to want to be familiar with. And again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to your manager or give me a call. I'm always happy to help. Well, there you are. Call if you have any questions, because as you know, I'm only a call away. So uses of the new RPA. So here's where you use the new RPA once it's released. The new RPA is designed for the sale of property built and zoned for single-family residential use. Now, that includes rental properties. So if it's a single-family dwelling, whether it's a rental or owner-occupied, it's the new RPA is the form to use. It is also the form to use for manufactured home sales, both personal and real property, with the manufactured home purchase addendum. By the way, I'll make this PowerPoint available to you after class. I'll give it to Lindsay and she'll email it out to everybody. Okay. In the form of a PDF. It's also used in probate transactions, with the probate agreement purchase addendum. So we got one RPA for, typical residential transactions, same RPA for manufactured homes, same RPA for probate transactions, same RPA for tenant-occupied single-family residences with the tenant-occupied property addendum, the TOPA. That's a new form. Also, and this, I just put this on here because I want to be complete. I don't think anybody on this call probably gets involved in this. It's not very common in Southern California, but tenancy in common or stock cooperative sales also use the current or the new RPA rather with the appropriate addendum. Now, deleted purchase agreements, there are two specific RPAs that have, purchase agreements rather, that have been deleted and they're replaced with addendums to the new RPA. The manufactured home purchase agreement, the old MHPA, second week of December, that will disappear. You won't use it anymore. You'll use the new RPA with the manufactured home addendum. And the same with the probate purchase agreement. That will disappear. The old PPA will go away. You'll use the new RPA with the probate addendum. Now, there are still some additional purchase agreements that will remain, and they're still going to be in place. And so for certain specific types of transactions, these RPAs are still the go-to RPA. So the purchase of residential property of more than one unit, 2 to 4 units, and multi-unit properties, you should be using the Residential Income Property Purchase Agreement, the RIPA. Why? Because there are multiple units in the sale, and the RIPA better addresses that than the RPA. Also use a specific form when you're purchasing new construction in a subdivision that's not yet completed. There are a few agents that do new construction, and you would use the New Construction Purchase Agreement, the NCPA. That currently exists now, not real common, but a few times it's used. One that you want to be very sure of, because this can get you in significant trouble, create significant problems if you don't use it. If it's an owner-occupied property that a notice of default has been filed, Civil Code requires that the notice of default purchase agreement be used. Now, it doesn't name that agreement, but what it says is it has very specific requirements that a purchase agreement must contain if the owner of the property is the occupant and an NOD has been filed. Civil Code talks about equity purchase. Civil Code calls those equity purchase agreements, where you're purchasing the equity of a person who's in default and may lose that equity if they're foreclosed on. And so the NODPA still remains. We're not in that market yet. There's some rumbling that we might be moving there in the next year or two, but I'm not convinced that it's going to be anything like it was, back in 09 and 10. It's when it, I think, peaked, if I got my years right. And then finally, for the purchase of vacant land, you would still use the vacant land purchase agreement. That still exists, and that would still be the go-to purchase agreement. All right, so let's do a review of the new RPA page by page and paragraph by paragraph. Try to walk you through. I'm going to highlight some of the things. And hopefully give you a comfort level with it, a familiarity with it. You're going to still want to review this on your own. And then again, any questions, reach out and we'll be happy to help you. So let's look at the very top of the RPA. And the first thing I want to talk about is a date prepared. That is an important thing to fill in. Every once in a while, it's not filled in. I'm hoping that the new RPA doesn't allow you not to fill it in. It has no legal significance, but it is very useful to identify the document. If you don't put a date in there, if we don't have a date prepared, then how do we identify a purchase agreement? Well, we might identify it by the date signed by, but that's not a very date, certain term, because signed by who, or accepted by. Well, that's not always obvious. When was the acceptance by the offering party delivered back to the by the receiving party, rather, delivered back to the offering party? We don't know when that delivery was made. So, it's hard to identify an RPA based on date, accepted. So RPA, or purchase agreement dated, that would be this date right here. So put that date in. It's the date you prepare it. It might be a week later before the buyer signs it. That doesn't have any legal significance. This date would still be the date you prepared it, and it's simply an identification tag, if you will. All right, so now the offer is from, and of course that's where the buyer's name goes, and list all buyers when you have buyers, and all known buyers, of course. And here's a nice feature. This form, I don't know if the old form does this or not, but I know for sure the new form does, the new RPA. It has what's called double stacking. So if you end up having a name or group of names that's longer than it can fit in this blank, it's going to put one on top of the other. And so it's, you notice there's plenty of white space for them to stack up names. So you can include all of the names of a buyer when you have a long or group of buyers. And so that's a nice feature. You can use a short version of names for entities as long as you name the entity in an Rcsd or in this contract at the end of the contract where that information appears. So you can do abbreviations if you want for entities, just to make it simpler to fill in. 2 items not to put here is assignee, or even worse, nominee. Assignee is very problematic. Why? Because one of the requirements of a contract is the principals are identified. So I can't have a contract with somebody, I don't know who they are yet, but the next guy who comes into my office, we're going to have a contract. Well, who is that person? Even if somebody who says I'm going to be the next guy coming to your office, and so he signs the contract, but he's not the next guy coming into my office, well, I didn't identify him. See, so I know that's kind of a silly kind of an analogy, but believe it or not, that's how the courts look at assignees. We don't know who the assignee is, so how can we hold somebody accountable to the contract? So courts don't like assignees at all, and you shouldn't use that term. And also nominee, courts have already held that nominees are not bound. Nominee means I'm going to name that person as responsible, but where did that person ever sign the contract? I'm going to nominate my neighbor to be responsible for my car payment. Well, if my neighbor doesn't sign the agreement, good luck holding them accountable. So putting nominee in here is an absolute disaster. Assignees is almost as bad. So a little tip, don't use those phrases. Name the buyer. Okay, property be acquired. That's the street address, of course, nothing new there. An important note, this has been added to the RPA. I don't know that it's common in our area. Apparently it's common in other parts of California. Sometimes the mailing address is not the same as the city identified. So somebody thinks they're living in La Jolla, but they're not. They're living in San Diego or something like that. So that might be the closest analogy. So this points out that, just because a city's named here doesn't mean that's the jurisdiction of the property. So I believe La Jolla is part of San Diego. In fact, I know it is. Okay, so the other change is they made it simpler here. You could always list more than one parcel number, but apparently Car Legal got lots and lots of questions. Can I name more than one parcel number? So they made it clear. They put a little S in parentheses here. So list the parcel numbers if you're selling more than one parcel with the same RPA. Now, interestingly enough, with SB 9, this is going to become more common when sellers start, or property owners rather, start doing lot splitting, and they own both parcels, and then they want to sell both parcels at once. You're going to see multiple parcels more commonly in the future. Numbers, that's the change there. All right, now the buyer and the seller are referred to as the parties. They are a party to the contract. The brokers and the agents are not parties to the agreement. Sometimes, and I've told this story to many of you, sometimes the other agent or sometimes the other principal, if it's already closed escrow, are demanding that our client do something and make them do it, or I have to do it. The most common is, our seller doesn't move out of the property when they're supposed to, and then either the buyer or the buyer's agent calls me and says, you have to get them out. You've got to go over there. You've got to get them out. No, I don't. I'm not responsible for my client. I'm responsible to my client. So we are not responsible for our client performing. I'm helping an agent here. I think the problem's finally resolved. I think it actually closed escrow. But the other agent was pretty obnoxious, frankly. Not our agent. Our agent was much more polite, but was demanding our agent do stuff that's really a principal requirement. We don't, we don't remove contingencies. Our client does. Your client didn't remove contingencies. You need to remove them. And I tried to explain to the agent, I'm not a party to the contract. I can't remove them. If my client doesn't remove them, that's not. I'm responsible to tell my client, hey, you're supposed to remove them. You may be in breach of the contract if you don't, but I'm not responsible for the action. Okay. Now, the next paragraph is the agency paragraph. So the first, nothing new here. Agency disclosure must be given prior to a contract formation. Typically, for sellers, it's given with the listing contract. Because it's not yet common for buyers to sign buyer representation agreements, they probably haven't been given a disclosure yet. The law says as soon as practicable before signing a contract, whether it be an agency contract, being the buyer's agent under contract, or the purchase contract. So this is the AD is bundled with the RPA and makes it easier for the buyer's agent to get the buyer's signature. It is no longer required for the buyer to give an agency disclosure to the buyer's agent, to give an agency disclosure to the seller if they are not the seller's agent. That has been eliminated, I think, last year in civil code. So now it's just giving an agency disclosure to your own client before your client signs a contract. That's important. Now, so there you go. Buyer's agent not required to give the seller's agent an AD signed by the buyer and vice versa. So there we go. All right, now confirmation. I want to talk a little bit about confirmation. I'm always surprised, and I know agents have a lot on their plate. Goodness knows it's tough enough doing real estate and now getting buyers' offers accepted and dealing with multiple offers and all kinds of contingency removals. I can understand why sometimes agents get confused about things. the one thing that can be very problematic is being confused about confirmation of agency. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that, let's talk about the seller's brokerage firm. So you identify the seller's brokerage firm, you put their license number there, and let's say they represent the seller only, or they represent both the buyer and the seller. Okay, obviously the seller's brokerage firm is not going to represent the buyer only. So seller or both buyer and seller. When the agent is identified, he must or she must, that confirmation must match what's on the broker line, because agency is broker specific. Now, the new form, I believe, locks out the ability for you to check a long box, check over here, when you've checked the other box up here. I think it's not possible now, but I wanted to point this out to you. Likewise, if the broker is a dual agent broker, then the agent is a dual agent. Same with the buyer side. If the buyer broker represents the buyer only or represents both the buyer and the seller, then the buyer's agent must match the buyer brokerage firm. Now, how does that work? Let me make it a little simpler. We got an agent, Sally Sharp, good agent, really good, got a nice offer prepared, or received an offer, got a nice listing here, rather, took a nice listing, and she works for Remax Connections. Okay, and she sold the listing. Another agent brought in the listing. And we have Charlie Clever, who brought the purchase contract in, and what do you know? He works for Remax Connections too. This is absolutely the only way confirmation can be filled out. If Sally Sharp has never met the buyer, wouldn't know the buyer, if he bumped into her on the street, she still represents the buyer. Why? Because it's the same brokerage. So the if Connections represents the buyer, represents the seller rather, and then also represents the buyer, then both agents represent both the buyer and the seller. That's important to note. If you got some questions on that, I'll cover that later. Now let's take another situation. Sally Sharp, same agent. Remax Connections, same agent. Charlie Clever, same agent. But what do you know? Charlie Clever is actually with Remax United right now. Remax United is owned by Remax Connections. Remax United is simply a DBA that Mike has purchased. And he's allowing those United agents who are not yet comfortable using the Connections name. By the way, I would argue the quicker you use the Connections name, the better it is for you as well, because you'll have, the market dominance of both entities in one sphere, if you will. So hopefully United agents will start calling themselves connection agents. But for now, if they don't, aren't doing that, we're not requiring it. But here's the key. United is owned by the same broker. It's the same broker of record. So those of us on this call who were from the United entity, if we are selling another United agent transaction or listing rather, that's pretty obvious, but it's still the same with Connections. Now, it's not the same if Remax All Pro sold a Remax Connections listing. Why? Because All Pro is owned by a different broker than Connections. So, or, United is owned by now a different broker than Connections. So it wouldn't be the same in that case. So if it's a different entity, the Remax isn't the key, it's the Connections. That's the key. Hopefully that's real clear. All right. Now, if more than one broker represents either the buyer or the seller, then you can attach, or you check that box, and if the box is checked, either seller or buyer, when this box is checked, the ABA is automatically going to attach to the contract. The ABA is the additional broker acknowledgement. All right, and that will automatically appear in your transaction. And then finally, the PRB has stuff, potentially completing buyers and sellers, the representation. That's a critically important form. And the good news is it automatically attaches even now, and that will continue to happen. And you'll want to make sure your clients always get that form and sign it as well. Okay, let's look at the grid. I want to see how far I can get through the grid here in this call. So the grid is paragraph 3, and it's the terms of the purchase and the allocation of costs. So again, as I said before, they are actual contract terms of the agreement, and the reference paragraphs provide further explanation. So paragraph 5 further explains the purchase price. Paragraph 32A further explains expiration of offer, if you will. So the paragraph references are to get more details about buyer and seller obligations. And of course, the contract advises both parties, the buyer and the seller, to read all of the pages, not just focus on the grid. And that's important because the tendency, as this form is being presented, is that agents right now, and we assume principals will do the same thing, they're going to think everything is in the grid. That's what they need to pay attention to. Why? Because that has all the variables. But the balance of the contract is just as important. Okay, now the grid has columns. And so for the beginning of the grid, the columns of paragraph number, that's going to stay the same, I think, throughout the entire grid. The paragraph title or the contract term, the terms and conditions of this particular item, and any additional terms. So for example, 3A is, the purchase price, and more details are found in paragraph 5, and you fill in the blank here with the purchase price. And once you fill in the blank, of course, then you check whether it's all cash or not. And if it's all cash, you check this box, and paragraph 3H is going to apply, and we'll get to that here hopefully before the end of the class. So you check all cash, purchase price goes in here. All right, close. There you go. Close of escrow. So the preference, and that's why it leads, it's not really defaulted. You got to fill in one blank or the other. But most escrows are written for 30 days, 45 days. Be careful of 10-day escrows. Those are very problematic. I would even argue 15-day escrows are very problematic. Maybe a 21-day escrow if you're in a hurry, but shorter escrows are prone to having problems. So the number of days after acceptance is the length of time the escrow is going to be. Now, by the way, the acceptance date is day 0. So if I have a 30-day escrow in this blank and it got accepted today, then day 1 is tomorrow. And acceptance is when the accepting party delivers their acceptance back to the receipt, to the offering party. And that depends on whether you're accepting a counter offer or a underlying RPA itself. You can also plug in the date if you want, and sometimes that is important. Expiration of offer, it's right up front now. It used to be back in the back by the signature page, but now it's right in front, and it's 3 days after all buyers' signatures occur on the document. It's not 3 days after delivery, by the way. So if my buyer signs the offer today and I goof around for 2 days before I deliver it to the seller, I've shortchanged the seller's ability to have 3 days. And I would argue you've harmed your buyer because the seller is now going to be inclined to not accept it in 1 day, and your seller's acceptance doesn't bind anybody because the buyer isn't obligated. So now there is no contract till the buyer reaccepts it if it's expired. So that's important to deliver it to the seller as quickly as possible after the last signature is obtained. Okay, going further down the grid, the initial deposit amount, there's both a dollar amount and a percentage. The percentage is for calculation purposes only and is not a contract term. So the dollar amount, if you fill that in, that's going to be the deposit amount. The form will automatically calculate the percentage. Now, if you want to give a 3% deposit, because you want to make your deposit look really strong and it's maximum liquidated damages that can be retained due to liquidated damages, you put in 3 here, the dollar amount will automatically fill in. Once this number appears, and there has to be a number here, once a number appears here, that deposit amount remains the same regardless of the purchase price. So if you wanted the deposit amount to go up because you're countering the purchase price up, you would have to include that the deposit amount must be increased at the time the offer is accepted. And so that's different from an increased deposit later in the escrow. So just be aware that this does not change once it's filled in. Now, the deposit has to be wired as the boilerplate directly to escrow within 3 business days. This is a nice rule of thumb. The only place in the RPA that the word business days appears is the deposit. Even the close of escrow is not business days. It's not 30 business days. It's 30 calendar days. Now, if the last day is not a business day, it will default over to the next business day. So if the close of escrow is 30 days and that occurs on a Saturday, well, the close of escrow by contract will be the following Monday, unless Monday's a holiday, then it'll be the following Tuesday. So the last day of escrow must be a business day, because that's the day escrow is going to close, and you can't close if it's not a business day. All right, increased deposit. That's money put into escrow to increase the deposit later during the contract term. This is not increasing the deposit with the offer. See, that's different. So if you check this box, then the form DID is going to automatically appear. DID replaces the old, I think it's the RID, receipt for increased deposit. That was always a confusing term. The civil code requires that if a deposit is increased during the course of the transaction and the principals want it to apply to liquidated damages, there must be an acknowledgement of that fact that this increased amount will also be applied to liquidated damages up to the 3% limit if appropriate. But that can only happen if at the time the increase is given, a DID is also provided, or it says it actually says a receipt for the deposit indicating that increased deposit applies to liquidated damages. But the law wasn't worried about making sure the buyer got a receipt for his money to prove he put it in. The law was concerned about making sure the buyer understood that your increase is also subject to liquidated damages. And so that's that. So they replaced RID because it created too much confusion, and replace it with delivery of increased deposit. And that satisfies civil code. And again, if you put in a percentage, it will calculate the number. If you put in a number, it will calculate the percentage. But the percentage is just an informational thing. Now, the default is that the deposit will be increased upon removal of contingencies, or it can be upon a date or upon some other event. So you can simply type that in. And again, if the event that you wanted the increased deposit, that triggered the increased deposit, and that event description took longer than this line, then the overflow text addendum is going to automatically kick in, and it's going to start with 3D2, increased deposit shall read as follows. And then it'll have all 6 lines of verbiage if that's what you had to type in here. So that's a nice feature. Every blank where you type has overflow capabilities. Okay, so you check this box if you want increased deposit. It doesn't automatically happen unless this box is checked. And when you check this box, it does not generate a DID with the purchase contract. That must be generated later when, provided to the buyer rather, later when the increased deposit is made. Providing a DID with the acceptance of the purchase contract and signing that does not satisfy civil code, because that DID, the information of the DID must be given to the buyer at the time the increased deposit is made. Okay. Loan amount. So it's pretty straightforward. So the first box here is talking about the first trust deed, the first loan. And so the loan amount is typed in here, or again, if it's an 80% loan, you can type in 80%, and then this number will automatically apply. Unlike deposit, if the purchase price goes up and you have an 80% loan, the loan amount will go up. So the loan amount percentage and down payment percentage does adjust with sale price. So 20% down goes up. If I'm paying $100,000 more for the house, I'm going to have a $20,000 higher deposit. So that does adjust. Now you specify the type of loan it is, or interest rate not to exceed. The boilerplate says 0 points, but if there is going to be points, you put that in. And the contingency for loan approval is, well, no, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. Let me take that back. It has nothing to do with contingency at this point. If it's an FHA or VA offer, then the buyer must deliver to the seller the list of lender required repairs, if such a list exists, within 17 days. So that is done with a repair request. The form flew out of my head now, but I think it's the V something or other. I forgot. But there used to be a form that stated what lender required repairs might be necessary, and that form has been eliminated. And now your lender required repairs are made a part of the repair request, and that must be done in 17 days. Now you check whether it's an FHA loan or a VA loan, and if it's an FHA loan, then the HID, the get a home, for your protection, get a home inspection, automatically attaches. So keep that in mind, that is required to deliver to a buyer, an FHA buyer. They must get that form. And so the good news is this form automatically attaches that. A little comment about these terms. It's not often a problem, but when it is, people are kind of shocked that it is a problem. And so my recommendation is you avoid the problem by filling this out correctly. Contracts cannot be vague, and if they are vague, they're interpreted against the person who provided the contract, and the vague terms. They're interpreted against the person who wrote the vague terms. Courts have held that failure to specify loan terms are so vague that you have an unenforceable contract. So it's not like the court will say, well, buyer, you were too vague, you didn't specify interest. So seller, what interest rate do you want to have this buyer have to accept? So let's say something horrible happens and interest rates go up 3%, and now instead of having a 5 or 6% market or a 4.5% market or whatever it is exactly today, we have an 8% interest rate. Well, the buyer can't afford it. But he was vague here. Well, they're not going to say, well, you were vague, so too bad, we're going to interpret it in favor of the seller. They're going to say you never had a contract in the first place. And so to avoid those problems, and I've actually got case law where buyers have used the failure, the buyer's own agent and the buyer themselves not specifying these terms as a way of avoiding a contract that they had already removed all contingencies and still wanted the deposit back. So they argued, we don't even have a contract because my loan terms were vague, and the courts have agreed with that. So that's not a good practice to leave these things blank. So it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Interest rates shouldn't be going up more than 1% or 2% in the next 30 days. So you can put in a not to exceed and have a reasonable amount, assurance that you'll be fine. So fill that in. Okay, if there's a second, that would be additional financing, and this would be the second amount, and you can put in a percentage if you want. It'll go back and forth. That will also change with the price, and again, the loan terms are specified here. Now, a second is never going to be FHA or VA. It could be seller financing. It's conventional. It's coming from an institution unless you check seller financing or other. Finally, or almost finally, occupancy type. If it's owner occupied, that's going to be the default. You check the box if it's secondary, like a vacation home or a second home, or if it's investment, you're buying a rental property. You check that box. That's important for the lender. Balance of down payment, you put in that number, and then finally, total purchase price. That's going to appear down there. All right. Credits are going to be right up front and a separate box right for the credits. You don't have to put it in any special place in the purchase contract. There's going to be a place for seller credits, if any, to buyer. You check this box and then the dollar amount of the credit. So it can be a percent of purchase price. That's pretty rare. It's probably more going to be the dollar amount. This percentage will appear if you put in a dollar amount, but it's for calculation purposes. The credit is usually for buyer closing costs. A buyer cannot receive cash, so it's not going to be money to the buyer. You don't want to check this box and say repairs because the lender is going to want the repairs done. So don't check other and then repairs. If you're getting a credit for the repairs, well, the credit applies to closing costs. The buyer's got the money in the bank, so he keeps the money that's in the bank that he was going to use for closing costs, and he makes the repairs with that money. So it sort of works the same, but the minute you put the word repairs in here, you've got a problem with your lender, and the lender's going to want to see, as you all know, this purchase contract. And lenders, many of the lenders are very familiar or getting familiar with this change, and some of these changes were suggested by lenders. Now, I'll give you an example where other might occur, which is not cash to buyer. Other might be paying off. I've actually done this more than once. I've convinced a seller when I represented a buyer to pay off the buyer's lease. The seller will buy the house, but he's got 2 more months left on the lease, and it's going to take the seller, the landlord, probably 2 months to find somebody. So this buyer is going to lose that money. So we'll buy your house. We'll even pay a couple of extra dollars for it. That gets financed, of course. But seller, credit the buyer a lease payoff, and we'll pay off the lease through escrow. So that's just one example where other might occur. There is. Well, I didn't click to highlight what we're talking about. So there is a box for additional finance terms if you need it. Okay, now, verification of all cash. The default is now always with the offer. So, and that's important because the best time to get a verification is with the offer. You got an all cash buyer, but you haven't verified he's got funds. And then later, escrow is falling apart. Why? Because the buyer hasn't sold his house. He didn't want to tell anybody. Why? Because he's already written 3 offers with COPs and they got rejected outright. So he and unfortunately the agent cooperated. We're just not going to tell the seller. And we've actually had, I won't name anybody, but we've actually had agents who will call me up and say, well, my buyer's got to sell his home. Well, did you know that? No. Did you verify funds? No, not really. Well, that's your problem. So verifying funds is critical with an all-cash offer. And here's the good news. Contract says it's got to be with the offer, boilerplate, or check 3 days. If a buyer submits an offer and says within 3 days, I'm suggesting to the seller's agents out there, you counter back, attach to offer. Acceptance contingent upon buyer verifying funds, and you don't even have an offer. Because if you accept the offer and then wait the 3 days, and they don't provide verification of funds that are satisfactory, you now got to go through the formal process of giving notices to perform and then canceling the contract. And it can be problematic if it's contested by the buyer. But if you don't even have a contract until you see those verification of funds, you just don't have a contract. It's simple, very easy. Now, it's the same with down payment and closing costs. The boilerplate of the old RPA said within 3 days. Now, the option, the boilerplate, is attached to the offer. And there's the verification of, got to have cash for down payment, closing costs. Let's make sure the buyer's got it. And then verification of loan application, again, attached to the offer. What is that? That's either a pre-qual, not too common anymore. So you check the box, pre-qual, pre-approval, far more common, not as common as it could be, fully underwritten approval. Now, everyone knows the lender's going to have an out if something changes. They're going to do a credit report the night before closes. And if the buyer went out and bought a van, I actually had a buyer do that when I was selling. I had a buyer buy a van the night before escrow closed. He actually bought it a couple days earlier, and it appeared on their last minute credit check that most lenders do, and it screwed up his ratios. And I asked my buyer, why in the world did you buy the van? Because I want to use it to move my furniture into my new house. Well, here's the bad news. You're not going to get the new house now because you don't qualify for the loan anymore. So fully underwritten approval is not going to be an absolute guarantee the loan will be funded, but it's a whole lot better than a pre-qualification, or even a bit better than a pre-approval. So you can, as a buyer, you can strengthen your offer by attaching that fully underwritten approval to an offer. And many lenders are offering that now. Okay, 3I is left blank. Why? Because I looks like 1, and do you mean 3I or do you mean 31? So they don't have a 3I. That's good. J is verification of condition, which is the famous walkthrough. That's 5 days prior to close of escrow. This often gets confused. We'll talk about that in a little more detail. It is not a contingency of closing, and that's misunderstood. What that means is if the buyer discovers something new that he doesn't like, but it existed in the property, he can't say, oh my gosh, I didn't see that. That's broken. I'm not closing till you fix it. If that was broken when he bought it, that doesn't work. But if the buyer goes in and says, hey, where's the third bedroom? I see a pile of ashes here. Well, guess what? Yeah, you do get to cancel. Why? Because the walkthrough revealed a significant breach of contract. So with repairs, the walkthrough is used to verify repairs are done. I always tell buyers, look, I'm not a lawyer. I'm certainly not a judge. I'm not either. I can't tell you for sure. But if you have a dripping faucet that the seller was supposed to repair and he didn't, you may have a problem not closing escrow and not being responsible for damages either you suffer or the seller suffers because you didn't close escrow because the faucet's dripping, because the courts probably won't call that a material breach. And so they're going to expect you to close and then go after the seller for the new faucet. And, probably not worth having a big dispute over a dripping faucet. But if you do a walkthrough and, they were supposed to install a new hot water heater, a new range, and a new air conditioner, and none of that was done, I would argue that's material. And you probably don't want to close. I've had the other side say, well, I'm sorry, your walkthrough is not a contingency. You have to close. No, we don't. You were supposed to put in a new hot water heater. You didn't do it. That's pretty material. The buyer's not going to move in and only have cold showers for the next couple of days. So don't misunderstand that. But the verification is meant to verify the home is in condition it was or agreed to be and subject to repairs, and that the repairs were, in fact, completed satisfactorily. And that's 5 days prior to close of escrow. Now, assignment, I'm going to talk about that more in detail in the next class. But the assignment request must be submitted within 17 days, or it is negotiable, but the boilerplate is 17 days. Why? Because Assignments that are done 2 days before escrow closes are very problematic. They're problematic for the agent, quite frankly. They're problematic for the seller because now the seller's having a hard time documenting that the assignee, the added buyer, got all the disclosures. And if there was something in a disclosure that the assignee wasn't aware of, he might sue the seller. So the seller wants, the assignee to document that they got all the disclosures. We as a brokerage certainly want that, and it can screw up closing. So assignments at the 11th hour and those kinds of assignments tend to be, we're going to add my mother because I don't have enough income, to qualify for the loan, but my mom and I together do. Well, that should have been figured out within 17 days. So that's why the boilerplate is there. Likewise, somebody buys the property, but they intend to assign it to another entity. That's not necessarily not allowed, but you need to let us know you're going to do that within 17 days so we can get signatures from that other entity on all of our disclosures. We can get everything lined up, make sure that if there's a loan that that person qualifies for the loan, whatever. You need time to do that. Okay. And we'll talk more about the rules governing assignment. The contract does say assignment must be approved by the seller, but it also says the seller cannot unreasonably withhold approval. So if the seller simply wants to use it as the way to get out of the contract, that will not work. That's been tried, by the way. It won't work because that's an unreasonable refusal. But if, I have a few dollars in the bank and I have a pretty good income, and I assign it to a homeless person that I ran into because I, have a soft heart and hopefully he can find some money somewhere. Well, the seller probably has the right to refuse that assignment because there's very little chance that property would close. All right. The next paragraph is the loans. I'm going to try to get through that. We're getting close to where we might break. As you can see, most of the details are in this grid. So let's look at, now the headings change a little bit. So we've got the subparagraph, the paragraph within the body of the contract that's referenced. Now we have the title contingencies. So these are all contingencies. Notice how they're all grouped in one spot, 3L. This is 3L of the grid. Time to remove contingency. Look at this. All the removal of contingencies in one spot. Isn't that nice? And then, contingencies removed. Have they been removed? And what's the discussion of that? So we'll go through this quickly. I want to point out something. I'll talk about it again and again. But let's just take a look. Notice the one number. See, the standardization, 17 days, 17 days, 17 days. Now, one could argue 17 days to get loan approval, kind of quick. So be sure to check with your lender. If your lender says no way, well, then you're going to want to put in a number here, 21 days. But 21 days went out the window. It wasn't that we expect loans to be approved faster. Quite frankly, the decision was made that it was better to standardize than have different numbers for different likelihoods. Some things are going to take longer than others. But we have different numbers, it sort of drives everybody crazy. But you could have different numbers. You could put 25 days here, 10 days here, 15 days here, 14 days here, 31 days, whatever. You could put in all these numbers if you want. But part of what the goal of this contract reorganization is to make everything clear up front. Right, no digging around through the I didn't notice that. I'm going to show you there's one change. I don't think I'll get to it today yet, but maybe I will. That sort of defeats a little, for lack of a better word, trick that I've been teaching, Larry's been teaching for a long time, and it has served us well. And that is the notice of buyer to form, lengthening that 2 days. And the reason it served us well is it's buried in the paragraph, and most listing agents never saw it. One of our agents wrote an offer on a listing that an agent who used to be with us had, and now she was independent. And our agent changed the notice to buyer to perform from 2 days to 3 days, because that's what we teach. And that agent countered back, with the statement, I've been to Walt's classes. You're not going to have a 3-day notice to perform. It's going to be back to the 2 days, like the boilerplate says. So anyway, I'm ahead of myself a little bit. Let's take a look at these very quickly. So the loan is a 17-day contingency, or you check the box, no loan contingency. Now, if you check the box, no loan contingency, well, then there's some terms in paragraph 8A that are going to apply that you're going to want to be somewhat aware of. And those terms state that the buyer does not have a loan contingency, obviously, because you checked that box. He still has an appraisal contingency, unless he checks that as well. He is not precluded from getting a loan. He just does not have a loan contingency. The seller cannot interfere with a cash buyer or a buyer. Well, I'm mixing things up a little bit. A cash buyer is where you can still get a loan. With a loan contingency, you're getting the loan, you're saying you're getting a loan, but you don't have a contingency. So I've got myself confused a little bit. When you are a cash buyer, you do not have a loan contingency. It says that in the in the contract body, but you can still get a loan, and the seller can't interfere with that loan application. But if you in fact don't get the loan, you don't have a loan contingency to bail on. If you check no loan contingency, you're saying, "Oh, I'm going to still get a loan, but I'm so sure I can get the loan, I'm going to strengthen my offer by removing the contingency." Same with appraisal. Now, appraisal has taken into something that's a very simplified and is going to prevent agents. Some agents are still making mistakes when they are modifying the current appraisal contingency. So in the new form, it's going to be very simple. So the appraisal contingency is based on the appraised value at a minimum of the purchase price, and that's the boilerplate, unless you check this box or. So somebody buys a house and it's listed for $800. They're buying it for $900. It probably is going to appraise for $800, but there's 30 offers on the property, and the buyer said, "No, I'll pay $100,000 over appraisal." So the best way to for a seller to be protected that the buyer will in fact pay $100 over appraisal is to check the box. And if they're paying, and I forgot my numbers now, they bought it for $900, it's going to appraise for $800. They can check the box. Because that's what the comps say. They can check the box. As long as it appraised for at least $800, I'll still pay $900 for it. And so you still have an appraisal contingency. So if it appraises at $750, well, no, that's way too low. I'm not obligated to perform. Hope that's kind of clear. If it's not, give me a call and I can walk you. But this is much simpler. You can just check this box and put in a lower threshold if you want. Okay. Now, if there's no appraisal contingency, keep in mind that if it's an FHA or VA offer, it does not eliminate the mandatory clause protections that FHA and VA buyers have by civil code. And so civil code, notwithstanding any other document, grants an FHA or VA buyer the right to cancel and get the deposit back if it doesn't appraise at the purchase price. And that is not waivable. So even a VA buyer who says no appraisal contingency and says, no, I'll pay whatever, if they have a change of heart, the seller should understand all you got is a gentleman's agreement or a lady's agreement that you cannot enforce. All right. Investigation of property contingency. So the investigation of property is the buyer conducting investigations, hiring inspectors, and investigating the property. There's also a separate a separate part, let me say this correctly. There's a separate part of the investigation of property contingency, which is looking at seller documents. And that's down here. That is not part of this investigation contingency. So when the buyer gets documents from the seller detailing the condition of the property, that used to be considered part of the investigation of the property, reviewing the seller documents. It's now a unique contingency. All right. Now, if well, let me go back here. If you have a investigation contingency and you remove it, you can remove it with the offer. And if you do that, you attach a CR. By the way, you do not need a CR if you check the no loan contingency or no appraisal contingency. But you do need a CR if you're waiving any other contingency at the time of an offer being made. You would attach the CR. Or when you do remove the contingency later, removing a contingency does not remove your right to access the property. So you remove the contingency, let's say you remove that in 10 days, but you don't change this to 10 days. This is not a contingency. It is just a right to access the property for 17 days, whether you have contingencies or not, maybe for measuring, maybe for getting estimates for repairs you want to have done, the buyer wants to have done after close of escrow. And so that's sort of detailed here. The buyer's right to access the property for informational purposes is not a contingency and doesn't create an additional cancellation right. And they have that access for a minimum of, boilerplate says a minimum of 17 days. All right, hope that's kind of clear. Review of seller documents, as I said, that's a separate contingency. It's the same contingency window. Anytime that documents that the seller must provide are provided late, you get the equivalent of 5 days or the contingency period, whichever is longer. So the seller needs to provide them in 7 days. Let's say he takes 8 days. Well, you're still only going to have 17 because 8 plus 5 is 13. So this is longer. Let's say he provides them in 15 days. Well, you're going to have 20 days. Why? Because you had the 17, you add the 3 on top of the 17, you got 5. In other words, from the 15, you now have 20 days. So whichever is longer after receipt. Now, another thing I want to point out, if contingencies are removed, and then the seller later provides certain documents, unless they are, you can call them TDS type disclosures. Providing the document does not reinstate the contingency. The most common one is a buyer removes all contingencies and then during the escrow gets the HOA documents, doesn't like what's in the HOA documents. Now argues, I got these HOA documents, I got 5 days. No, you didn't. Why? Because you removed all your contingencies. And it doesn't reinstate the contingency. The only time a contingency would be reinstated by a disclosure is if it was an amended TDS. And HOA information is not included in the TDS in general. One could argue there's a certain question about lawsuits. If that were the case, I'm getting into the weeds a bit, but I could probably see someone arguing that successfully. But in general, you don't like the dues or something, or the minutes talked about increasing the dues in 6 months, and you don't like that. Well, that wasn't part of the TDS, so it's not going to reinstate the contingency of the TDS contingency, and it's not going to reinstate the HOA documents contingency either. So be careful when you remove contingencies. You might get information that doesn't necessarily reinstate those contingencies. 5 days isn't automatic if you've removed contingencies already. Preliminary title report, 17 days, review that. If you don't like some of the exemptions that the title company puts on the title report that are not going to be paid off, like, for example, if it's a leased solar, they're going to exempt the lien on the solar equipment from their title insurance. And if a buyer doesn't like that, he has 17 days to object to that and cancel. He's not going to convince the title company to remove that objection. Common interest disclosures, your HOA documents, you got 17 days. Civil code requires certain documents be provided, and then the contract provides other documents, and that appears later in the contract. And then disclosing leased or lien items, you have to disclose that in 17 days. The most common is solar panels and propane tanks. That tend to be the most common leased and sale items. Folks, I think this is probably a good spot to end. I'm running a little over, and I don't want to go too long. I want people to be able to review this information in a single setting. So we're going to pick it up with paragraph 3M. Well, let me do the last L8. I'm going to do that, and then we'll go L8, the last loan contingency item, if you will. And it's a loan contingency because it's probably part of the loan approval. The cash for getting the down payment is coming from the sale of the buyer's property. So if they check this box, then their purchase is contingent upon the sale of their property, and the COP will automatically attach. We're going to come back in, I think, 2 weeks, and we're going to talk about the balance of the grid and to get into the first 3 or 4, maybe 5 pages of the RPA itself, and then in the last class, wrap up the RPA. And with that, Lindsay, let me stop my screen share. Do we have any questions in the chat?
Drew Reynolds asks, he sees that on the designated electronic addresses, and it includes the text number. If the buyer's agent includes our phone number, can we remove it via the counter to just an email, since we cannot really document text messages?
You could, yeah, you could definitely do that. Now you can counter out, obviously they're going to put their own information in, and so you wouldn't counter out. So you're the listing agent, and the buyer puts his electronic address in. You're not going to mess with that, but he also puts your cell number in or your text number in or whatever, and you don't want that. Yeah, you could counter it out and replace it with the number you do want. Good question. Yeah, absolutely.
Jeannie asks, is the confirmation of agency going to be mandatory because in the new RPA, because some of the agents forget to check those boxes?
It's absolutely mandatory. Oh, is it mandatory? Well, can you complete an RPA without it? I think you probably could. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, you print it and send it off. Maybe you can. I'm not sure what the question is. It is mandatory. Civil code requires it. If it is not done correctly or done incompletely, I think you can generate an RPA without it, because in my training, we talked about, and I've always taught this, by the way, so nothing new, but I'm glad that they're teaching it. You have to counter a confirmation of agency. The only time we were sued in the last 5 years, we were sued by a buyer for not fulfilling fiduciary duties to the buyer. Guess what? We didn't represent the buyer. I read the lawsuit. They actually filed the lawsuit. They sued for significant dollars, several $100,000. I'm reading the lawsuit. I'm giving it to our E&O, sending it to our attorney, and I'm saying, well, we don't do any of this. This is buyer agent stuff. I knew the listing agent. I knew the transaction. I get the RPA out, and it says, Remax United represents both buyer and seller. Had a heart attack. I called the agent. The good news is I was polite. I didn't start screaming, but I was polite. We got a problem. The RPA says we represent both sides. To which she very calmly said, well, you didn't look at the counter offer. I counted it. So if you get wrong agency, it's critical you change that, because if this closes and that's never corrected, we'd be out of luck. Okay.
Ron Wilson wants to know if you get separate overflow addendums for each different overflow.
That's a great question. I don't know that answer. I'll check on that. I'll find out.
Barbara Dudek wants to know, how do you know a credit amount ahead of the physical inspection?
Oh, you don't. You can always add that later. Where that's more common, and we don't see that up here too much, but in South Bay, many offers have buyer closing costs as part of the offer. So in the old days, some of the people on the call have hair that looks kind of like mine, so I'm assuming you're kind of my age. But VA no-nos, right? I haven't heard that term in a long time, but I've written a few of those, even in Mira Mesa. Good luck with that in today's market, but VA no-nos, no down payment, no closing costs. So if you were to write such an offer today, you would put those closing costs in the RPA. But yeah, that does not preclude you from, as a part of repair negotiations, offering a credit or accepting a credit. Another great question.
Vicky Varnals asks, she's seen agents representing the buyers when she represents the seller check the box that they're providing proof of funds, but they do not. Is the best practice to counter that they provide proof since it was not given, and any verbiage stating that it was not provided since they checked it was?
You want to be sort of careful. If you got a house that you had listed for 6 months and this is the first offer you got, you're going to be a little gentler. But in this market, I would argue you don't have an offer because the offer is incomplete. It'd be like they didn't include page 3, and in this offer, that's critical because that's part of the grid. Well, you don't have an offer. So they said, part of my offer is verification of funds, but I didn't give it to you. Well, you don't have an offer. So I would email them and say, I can't present this offer until you give me verification of funds. Now, if they said, well, I can't have it till tomorrow, then you could counter it with an acceptance. But I would try to get the verification first. Hope that helps, Vicki.
Charla wants to know, for the example, and I think she's referring to the appraisal example, for that example used for appraisal, would you just put, she's put $100 in the box, but I think she meant $100,000.
I meant $100,000.
Yeah. So you would just write $100,000 in that box?
No, you write the threshold. So let me be a little clear, and I'll write the number down because sometimes I make examples and I forget the numbers I'm using and my examples fall apart. So you got a house that's listed for $800,000 and you've comped it out and it's probably worth around $800,000. Would it appraise for $820? It might, but because there are 30 offers, the bidding got up to $950. All right, and the buyer says, the buyer says he knows about this because he's writing one of the offers, I guess, to make my story have sense. The buyer knows that to compete and write an offer, he's got to beat $950 and he's willing to do it. So he could, but he's not willing to pay $950 if it doesn't appraise for $800. The boilerplate says if the purchase price is $950, it has to appraise for $950. But he can write in that blank $800,000, not $800. So it's not $150, or I mixed my examples up a little bit, but it's not the difference. It's the minimum appraisal that the buyer wants to see, or I won't buy it. So the buyer might say, look, if it appraises for $800, I'll pay $950. But if it appraises for $700, I'm only going to pay $850. See, he's going to pay $150 over appraisal, but don't let that confuse you. The $150 over appraisal doesn't go in the blank. The minimum appraisal the buyer wants goes in the blank. Is that clear? Does that make sense? Lindsay's nodding. Does anybody else?
That makes sense.
Okay. If it doesn't, call me one-on-one and I'll go through it.